Welcome back to the Damage Report. It is Thursday. I'm John Arola, and we, as always, have a gigantic show. Actually, too much. I have all of these papers, so many good stories. It is unlikely we will get through everything, but we're going to try to because these stories are really important. We're going to be starting off shortly with Rudy Giuliani being Rudy, and we've got some rigging of polls, and I want to talk a little bit about that, and then put it in context of other candidacies in this same sort of thing. We've got bad news about the war in Yemen and America's continued involvement, secret involvement in the war in Yemen. Some leaked documents revealing that. And along the way, we're gonna have two awesome guests. So an investigator at the facility where the comatose patient was raped and eventually gave birth tried to investigate it for corruption in advance of that happening, and that investigation was shut down. So Charlie Loftus is gonna be joining us to break that down. Later on the show, Jonathan Larson is going to be joining us, talking about his reporting on the National Prayer Breakfast and the continuing campaign to get Democrats to no longer attend this yearly event. We'll be talking about that. And if there's time at the end of the show, Fox News, for them to really stand out in the area of sexism takes special effort. And I want to give them credit because they have put in the effort. And they had a guest on that said something that just shocked me. So we'll play that. And then, there's a lot of candidates who have announced they'll be seeking the presidency. There are some who now people want to seek the presidency. We'll be talking about one of those at the end of the show. That is Cardi B. So with that, why don't we jump into the political news of the day? Rudy Giuliani is Donald Trump's lawyer, and he is mostly known in a legal sense for going on cable news shows and saying things that get him, and far more importantly, the president of the United States in trouble. So he was on with Chris Cuomo, and he did that, making a claim about his past claims about the investigation of the president that makes literally no sense. Let's take a look.
Mr. Mayor, false reporting is saying that nobody in the campaign had any contacts with Russia. False reporting is saying that there has been no suggestion of any kind of collusion between the campaign and any Russians. Because now you have Paul Manafort giving poll data that winds up leading to this coincidence.
Well, you just misstated my position. I never said there was no collusion between the campaign or between people in the campaign.
Yes, you
have no idea if I have not. I said the President of the United States. There is not a single bit of evidence the President of the United States committed the only crime you could commit here, conspired with the Russians to hack the DNC.
First of all, crime is not the bar of accountability for a president. It's about what you knew, what was right and what was wrong, and what did you deceive about. Those are going to be major considerations.
The president did not.
He said nobody had any contact. Tons of people had contact. Nobody colluded. The guy running his campaign,
he didn't say
was
nobody.
Working on an issue at the same time as the convention.
He said he didn't. He didn't say nobody. How would you know that nobody in your campaign?
He actually did say that, Rudy. He said nobody, and then he said, as far as I know.
He said it in well, as far as he knows, that's true.
Okay, so I have watched that video several times now, and I have to admit that I don't know what Rudy Giuliani is trying to communicate. It is possible that there is some sort of subtext to his argument that I'm not hearing, but if I'm not hearing it, it's because it is drowned out by the sound of the goalpost being torn out of the ground and then racing off at the speed of light. Because again, for at least the 10th time, the goalposts have been moved on exactly what this investigation needs to find to impress someone like Rudy Giuliani. So now it is, I never said that nobody colluded. I just said that the president didn't collude. And that's what our stance has been. That, of course, is not true, as Chris Cuomo begins to point out. Now, he doesn't have the specifics there because, and I think this is relatively charitable, but not overly charitable, he could have never predicted that Rudy Giuliani would make this claim because it is bonkers. So let's just go through a couple of the times that they have claimed, not what Rudy Giuliani is saying, but what Chris Cuomo attempted to respond with. So Donald Trump tweeted as far back as February of last year, Russia started their anti-US campaign in 2014, long before I announced that I would run for president. The results of the election were not impacted. The Trump campaign did nothing wrong, no collusion. So two things there. First of all, he thinks that Russia became anti-US in 2014. I would argue it started a little bit earlier than that. But he also says the Trump campaign did nothing wrong, no collusion. Then, much more recently, January 4th, how do you impeach a president who has won perhaps the greatest election of all time, done nothing wrong, quote, no collusion with Russia, it was the Dems who colluded. So that is not just a I didn't collude. That's the only ones who colluded are the Democrats. Now, that has been a literally insane talking point for a couple of years now that they have continued to spread. And if I wanted to, the rest of the show could be reading those tweets. He and Rudy Giuliani have repeatedly claimed over and over that there was no collusion. Rudy Giuliani, in an interview with Sean Hannity last August, said, the only collusion involved the intelligence community launching an illegitimate investigation based on the Steele dossier. So that's a little bit different than the Dems colluded. This is the deep state colluded, and those are the only people. He also claimed last July, quote, when I say the Trump campaign did not collude, I mean the upper levels of the Trump campaign, top 4 or 5 people. So that would still include at the time Paul Manafort, the guy he's attempting to define out of this now. And so there's a lot of issues there. I mean, first of all, there's an attempt to, before we ever see the Mueller report, if we see the Mueller report, or if we see an accurate version of the Mueller report, an attempt to define what needs to come out of it for them to care, for them to think that there could be any consequences. Quote, there is not a single bit of evidence the president of the United States committed the only crime you can commit here, conspired with the Russians to hack the DNC. So as Chris Cuomo points out, a clear crime would not be the only issue here, but much more broadly than that, that is not the only crime. There are all sorts of crimes, including obstruction of justice. Now, they don't want that to be talked about. They certainly don't want that to be investigated, but that is very much a part of this. And in the history of presidential impeachment, obstruction of justice, kind of a big deal. And so I can understand why they'd be scared, perhaps. But much more importantly than that is that this exists in an ongoing and ever-evolving timeline of the goalposts being shifted. So, look, if you go back to November of 2016, Hope Hicks said, quote, there was no communication between the campaign and any foreign entity during the campaign. So that's pretty far from, well, yeah, maybe senior people on the campaign literally colluded with the Russian government, but Trump didn't. They said, we didn't talk to any foreigners, ever. And you could go through to no contacts took place to our knowledge, or there were no meetings, or there were no planned meetings, or there were no meetings about this. And it changes over and over. And I started to compile the list, but I don't want to run through it all again because, first of all, at this point, you either care enough about this story and its import to be familiar with that, or you don't. You either are rational on this story or you are not. And I'm just too exhausted at this point to continue to try to catch up with the position of Trump and his legal team on this issue. We know what is going on. We can see them continually shifting their story as every bit of information comes out. That is a result not of a better understanding on their part of what's going on, but a result of constant lying about this story, that you have to continually change what you said based on what comes out. You are hoping when you make these claims that no more information will be revealed and your story will seem consistent for a little while. But that doesn't happen. We do find out more information, and so they have to continually revise their lies. That is not the stance of a group of people who are innocent in a general sense or a specific legal sense. That is what happens when you are guilty of something. I can't say definitely what, but if you continually lie, literally for years about this, that gives me very little confidence that in the end you will proven to be innocent. There's much more on this. Honestly, I find it too exhausting. It is such a bald-faced lie. It makes me think that Rudy Giuliani, it's not that he's like losing it or whatever. I mean, certainly he's feeling some pressure having to work for Donald Trump, but I think he has learned from Donald Trump. I mean, as we talked about with Jason Stanley, Donald Trump lies to show the power that he has. The inability of anyone to make the fact that he's lying count. That is a show of force, a show of power. Rudy Giuliani apparently has learned something from that because he is making claims that are obviously false, that are easily disproven, hoping that no one will care, hoping that it won't matter and there will be no consequences. So now it is up to the media, it is up to the country to see whether or not that will in the end be true. But there are other news that I want to move on to. So, bizarre story breaking last night from the Wall Street Journal, and that has to do with Michael Cohen and the rigging of polls during the 2016 election to try to make Donald Trump stand out as a candidate. Long before he had risen to #1 and it seemed like a foregone conclusion that he would be the candidate, they apparently were manipulating things online to try to make that the case. So in early 2015, a man named John Gauger, who runs a small technology company, showed up at Trump Tower to collect $50,000 for having helped Michael Cohen, then Donald Trump's personal lawyer, try to rig online polls in his boss's favor before the presidential campaign. So this is just a funny little note. He goes there to get this money. In his Trump Organization office, Mr. Cohen surprised the man by giving him a blue Walmart bag containing between $12,000 and $13,000 in cash and a boxing glove that Mr. Cohen said had been worn by a Brazilian mixed martial arts fighter, which is, I guess, an interesting little note, an interesting tidbit. It's probably not $40,000 worth of interest, though. So I just mentioned that because this is just another data point in the long history of if you work for Donald Trump, you will not get paid. You will at best get dirty sportswear, I guess. So, but the thing is, he did actually do the work that he's not being paid for. So in January of 2014, so this is before Donald Trump announces, before he descends from the golden escalator, all that stuff, Mr. Cohen asked Mr. Gauger to help Mr. Trump score well in a CNBC online poll to identify the country's top business leaders by writing a computer script to repeatedly vote for him. Despite that script, Mr. Gauger was unable to get Mr. Trump into the top 100 candidates. Let's pause there for 1 second. Those were blessed times. He couldn't reach number 100 with his huge name and his TV show and a script that was helping him to do that. Obviously, we have descended as a society since then. So in February of the next year, as Mr. Trump prepared to enter the presidential race, Mr. Cohen asked him to do the same thing for a Drudge Report poll of potential Republican candidates. Mr. Trump came out in 5th with about 24,000 votes, or 5% of the total. Again, blessed days where even when you have a paid-for cyber campaign to try to make you look more popular than you are, you end up in 5th. Now, of course, the joke in the end is not on them, it's on us because he's our president now. But that's what they were doing to try to elevate him. And after this news broke, Michael Cohen has responded by saying, as for the Wall Street Journal article on poll rigging, what I did was at the direction of and for the sole benefit of Donald Trump, the POTUS. I truly regret my blind loyalty to a man who doesn't deserve it. Now, in the end, with the landscape of all that we know now, this is a relatively minor story. I would say this is probably far more common than you would think, not just for Donald Trump, but for many political candidates. So be on the lookout for this in the future, potentially, as polls in an increasingly not just diverse, but also well-stocked with people, Democratic primary this time around comes around. So why do we care about this at all? The reason I care to some extent is that I want to give credit to Sarah Kendzior for something that she wrote back in July of 2016 about this sort of thing. So Donald Trump put out a video where he talked about how long people clapped for him at the Republican National Convention. And it gets into the idea of why you falsely elevate a person. She says the applause video was meant not only to glorify Trump, always a key Trump goal, but to signal to Americans that it's acceptable, even laudable, to celebrate his opinions. It is okay, the video implies, to openly applaud a candidate who calls Mexicans rapists, posts anti-Semitic memes, praises authoritarian leaders, wants to round up Muslims, and has created a political climate in which white supremacist David Duke feels comfortable enough to run for the US Senate. It is normal, the video implies, because others are clapping with you. Selective use of data and polls help Trump prove his mainstream appeal. Trump may be best known for his ability to stir populist emotion, but polls and statistics are how he markets his fantasies as fact. And now we know that even before he started running, they were already attempting to do that. When you have a candidate as purposefully controversial, offensive, racist, anti-Semitic, misogynistic as Donald Trump, it is really important that you make people feel comfortable coming out of the woodwork to support that candidate. And a variety of different tools are used to accomplish that. The public rallies, which the media did an unfortunate great job of helping to amplify, the Twitter activity, and certainly the polls. And by the way, if the polls are rigged, some of the Twitter activity might also be rigged. I would look into that too. But this has been his strategy from the very beginning. Give mainstream appeal to the least mainstream candidate that has ever existed in terms of his positions. This is an extremist through and through, and he has used these sorts of tools to manipulate psychologically the American people from not just day one, but before day one. So interesting news. Anyway, we do have to go to our first break. When we come back, Charlie Loftus is going to be joining us to talk about his attempted investigation of the facility where a comatose patient was raped. After that,
we need to talk about a relatively new show called the Republic, or UNFTR. As a Young Turks fan, you already know that the government, the media, and corporations are constantly peddling lies that serve the interests of the rich and powerful. But now there's a podcast dedicated to unraveling those lies, debunking the conventional wisdom. In each episode of On the Republic, or UNFTR, The host delves into a different historical episode or topic that's generally misunderstood or purposely obfuscated by the so-called powers that be, featuring in-depth research, razor-sharp commentary, and just the right amount of vulgarity. The UNFTR podcast takes a sledgehammer to what you thought you knew about some of the nation's most sacred historical cows. But don't just take my word for it. The New York Times described UNFTR as consistently compelling and educational, aiming to challenge conventional wisdom and upend the historical narratives that were taught in school. For as the great philosopher Yoda once put it, you must unlearn what you have learned. And that's true whether you're in Jedi training or you're uprooting and exposing all the propaganda and disinformation you've been fed over the course of your lifetime. So search for UNFTR in your podcast app today and get ready to get informed, angered, and entertained all at the same time.
The Phoenix facility, where a patient in a coma was raped and eventually gave birth, faced a criminal investigation over 2 years ago. But unfortunately, that investigation was dropped, and the chief law enforcement officer who was investigating the facility, Charlie Loftus, was forced out under suspicious circumstances. That chief law enforcement officer, Charlie Loftus, joins us now on the Damage Report. Charlie, welcome to the show.
Hello, John. Thank you for having me.
I'm glad to have you here, although I wish it was about a more optimistic story because this entire thing stinks. So the story that got everyone, interested in this facility, the tragic case of this patient who was raped, I think most people are familiar with that. But you had been interested in this facility for other reasons in advance of that. So what had you found that made you want to investigate that facility?
In mid 2016, around the area of May, June, the chief auditors at the Arizona Department of Economic Security came to me and said they had some abnormal billing practices from a facility called Hacienda Healthcare. Now, Arizona DES is basically the welfare manager for the state of Arizona. I came from the Arizona Attorney General's office where I was assistant special agent in charge. I was over the major fraud for all southern Arizona, the narcotics, statewide narcotics, the terrorism units, the forfeiture units, and public corruption units. So I came over to DES at invitation to help professionalize their law enforcement, and one of the first cases they brought me was this case called Hacienda. And apparently Hacienda had been investigated a few years prior, but what they had done was as Hacienda has several smaller companies under the Hacienda umbrella, and they were basically double, triple billing for the same services, transportation, room space, equipment, and the state just didn't catch on to what it was. And over this 1 year period, it was approximately a $4 million overbill. Now, this has been an ongoing situation with this particular facility for a couple, maybe 5 or 6 years prior to that. And the owner and the CEO of the corporation, the facility, was refusing to cooperate, not releasing any information, even after subpoenas. So the auditors, we had about a 45 person auditor team, brought this case to us, and I had about probably a little just shy of 20 sworn investigators there, but it was partly outside their skill set. But moreover, what's important is all these men and women, these investigators, reported to the governor, and they're at-will employees, so they can be fired for any reason at any time, including myself. So we packaged the case, and I presented it to the Arizona Attorney General's office, the former agency that I worked for, and I was assistant chief for, and they opened a criminal case for fraud on Hacienda Healthcare. Within about 2 weeks after that, we were fired. And one of the big things that was discussed was not just the criminal case, but we were going to stop the contract with the Hacienda. Now, if you stop the contract, it's really pass-through money to from the feds. So they were about 300% above normal facility per patient than national average. And so what happens if you cancel the contract? That pass-through money, that federal money that comes through the feds, through Arizona, into this facility is not allowed anymore. So you have to find an alternate location for these patients, or the state has to pay. Now, some of these patients are in very bad shape. They're on ventilators, and some of the costs are up around $10,000 a day for some of these patients. So you can see the concern for upwards around 35 patients, not only moving severely ill children, these are all children, by the way, or young adults, to other facilities, but also to manage their families, manage their health care, all in a nice, seamless transition, all while doing a criminal investigation on the facility. Of course, the facility was facing being shut down at that point. They have far more than 35 patients, but this is the cream of their billing. Of course, if they're able to bill 300% the normal average for a patient, they're certainly making a lot of money. Yeah. So the DES staff, the non-cops, the DES staff that were charged with this humanitarian crisis were terrified, because we were told over and over again, and many of these people had contact with the owner and operator of the facility. His name was William Timmons. That he often boasted that he was friends with the governor, Doug Ducey. And matter of fact, we did get some pushback from the governor's office in that there were some concerns about shutting this or having this facility investigated. Short comes to push that when I was told that there was connections, I personally, now I had a pretty big staff, but I personally went online and looked at the Arizona Secretary of State's website and saw, in fact, that this guy Timmons was a donor to Doug Ducey, and I had big concerns. And
I think understandably. So, look, the entire thing obviously seems very suspicious, very dirty. We know that now, thanks to this tragedy, sort of a silver lining, this facility has renewed scrutiny. I guess the idea is that were you and your compatriot not to have been fired and the investigation went forward, it's possible that some of these further crimes wouldn't have been committed. Is there any possibility that now that your story is being looked at once again, that there's any sort of responsibility that anyone that shut down this investigation, if there is influence, the fact that there was money, that there might be people held responsible for this facility continuing to operate?
Well, this is politics at its worst. The motivation was taking care of a donor and a donor source. In Arizona, we have a lot of issues with dark money. The chief of staff for Governor Ducey was a gentleman by the name of Kirk Adams. And he was in the California news a few years ago for big campaign violations. He took some money from a charitable organization and moved it to a nonprofit in Arizona for dark money contributions, and he was charged with campaign violations in California, even though he's an Arizona resident, and fined $1 million. So that gives you an idea of the characters I'm dealing with here. Yeah. So yes, and I don't say it could have been prevented. It would have been prevented because we were going to shut down that location. In that no patient receiving state funds would have been able to go to that facility. So that patient, even though she was there prior to our investigation, she would have been moved to another facility.
Yeah. Well, that makes the already tragic story even sadder. I hope that now people will pay attention to your story. People will look into this more. It is a really dark example of how corrosive money and politics can be when mixed. And Charlie, I want to thank you for joining us on the Damage Report and sharing your experience with us.
Thank you for having me. Have a great day.
You too. We're going to take a short break, but stick around. Not too long ago, America announced that it would no longer be providing aerial refueling for Saudi planes going on to bomb Yemen. And it was like, hey, great news. But aren't we still involved in the war in Yemen? Well, it turns out it depends on who you talk to because, let's see, General Joseph F. Dunford Jr., chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, just last month after that change said, the United States is, quote, not a participant in the civil war in Yemen, nor are we supporting one side or the other. So both parts of that statement, very interesting, very important, seems historically like a weird thing to say since 2015, the U.S. has backed the Saudi and UAE-led coalition's war against Yemen, providing weaponry, logistical assistance, including the aforementioned air-to-air refueling, intelligence sharing, and advisory support. It also provides support to the war through a classified operation called Yukon Journey. But I get what he's saying. That's in the past, and now we don't support them. Not only are we not directly involved, but we don't have a dog in this fight. But that's what they're saying. It's not necessarily the truth because Yahoo was able to get some documents. They did a Freedom of Information Act request, and turns out that's not remotely true. So these files were obtained from the Air Force's Central Command, and they show, quote, escorted 6 UAE F-16s to Red Flag. That's from December of 2017. Air Force document referring to an advanced aerial combat training exercise held for U.S. and allied pilots. Quote, assisted 150 airmen in challenging exercise to prepare for combat ops in Yemen. The document goes on to detail additional support provided by the U.S. Air Force's Air Warfare Center in the UAE. Quote, unit fighter personnel advanced the UAE's F-16 fighter pilot training program. 3 pilots flew 243 instructor sorties, 323 hours that created 4 new instructors and 29 combat wingmen who immediately deployed for combat operations in Yemen. So that's interesting because there are many different elements of the support for that war that we had provided. This sort of support was not anything that had been talked about, and it's certainly not anything that since then we have heard has stopped. So I think very legitimate questions remain as to, okay, we stopped the refueling, but what does that actually mean substantively in terms of our support for the Saudi war on Yemen and the continued death of so many civilians? And again, it's a matter of they're saying one thing, but all of the evidence points in the opposite direction. I will remind you, we had Ken Klippenstein of TYT Investigates on the show not that long ago, where he talked about his reporting for our continued effort with Saudi. We had this long-term contract that extends years into the future where we will continue to repair and provide replacement parts for their Air Force. That is support for the wars that they engage in with those planes, which coincidentally we sold to them. But, Josh Jacques, Lieutenant Colonel of CENTCOM, says, in response to this new reporting, by the way, as we said before in our statement, we do not conduct exercises with members of the Saudi-led coalition to prepare for combat operations in Yemen, which is an interesting response to documented evidence that we do exactly that. So look, maybe from the other side we could get more information. Unfortunately, we can't. The UAE's Ministry of Defense did not respond to multiple requests for comment. I can sort of understand that, I guess, but I would love to know what is going on with them if we're continuing to train them right before they fly into Yemen and launch those bombs and missiles and all of that. I would like to know that. And again, we've talked about this constantly, but the stakes could not be higher. A report by the UN Group of Regional and International Eminent Experts on Yemen determined that at least 16,000 civilians had been killed or wounded as of August of last year, although it noted that, quote, the real figures are likely to be significantly higher. And those are those who have been killed or wounded through military action and reported, as they imply there. Not all of the people who have died from cholera or starvation or associated instability since then. So there are literally tens, if not hundreds of thousands of lives on the line. I think we deserve a far better, more thorough, and more honest explanation from the U.S. military and the U.S. government as to what our continuing involvement in that conflict might be. We do have to take our next break, though. When we come back, Jonathan Larson of TYT Investigates will be joining us. Very interesting reporting that we had on TYT.com recently. He will break down what he found after this. In the story of Maria Butina, basically everything we've learned is sort of weird, but one of the weirdest sets of wrinkles are all of the various events that she popped up at over the course of a couple of years, including Republican speeches, but also the National Prayer Breakfast for some reason. And it turns out that that appearance might be a little bit more nefarious than it initially seemed. Joining us now to help break down some reporting on that, Jonathan Larson, managing editor and executive producer of TYT Investigates. Jonathan, welcome to the show.
Thanks, John.
Good to have you here. So before we jump into what you found, for those who might not be familiar with the National Prayer Breakfast and the significance that it holds in American politics, what do they need to know about this event?
Well, I think the main thing to know is twofold. One is its enormous reach. Presidents from every party have addressed it since the 1950s at the prayer breakfast. And also, it's supposedly a bipartisan organization. So you've got both Democrats and Republicans actively involved in the organization, the logistics, pulling it all together every year. So that's one aspect. The other aspect is, despite the involvement of some of our top officials, is the secrecy. It's notoriously secretive, not just in terms of allowing politicians to come and pray in private with confidentiality and seek solace, as they did quite notably during some sex scandals 10 years or so ago. But it's also secretive in terms of where they get their money, who's running the thing, things along those lines. So that combination has led to scandal more than once in the past, and the fact that it's now appears to have been a conscious, specific target of people who, it seems pretty clear, were working on behalf of the Russian government, suggests that there's reason for concern about what these events, and it's not just the prayer breakfast, but other events as well, what these events were being used for by the Russians. What did they want? How are they trying to get it? And what did they get?
So that is where you come in, because despite their attempts at financial secrecy, you were able to find out that Maria Butina didn't just happen to show up at the breakfast. The prayer breakfast was actually more involved than that. So could you describe your findings?
Sure. Well, so what was already known was in the affidavit against Maria Butina last summer, the FBI revealed that an unnamed organizer of the breakfast gave 10 spots at the breakfast to Butina and Torshin for the 2017 breakfast. Now, there was a little noticed interview not long after that where a pretty prominent organizer of the breakfast discussed giving them 10 spots. I don't think anyone has connected those dots since then, but it seems quite a coincidence for this person to have given 10 spots. And he says in the interview that it was to Butina and Torshin. So that seems a pretty tough conclusion to avoid coming to. But what we found was there's another organization which has ties to that exact same breakfast organizer. He's been involved with this other group as well. And this other group, which is called Leadership Development Seminars, it's based out in Seattle. It's also got multiple ties to the Fellowship Foundation, which is that secretive group behind the prayer breakfast, including literally funds, hundreds of thousands of dollars going back and forth, as well as literally in one tax filing, the Fellowship Foundation, we didn't even include this in the article, but I'll tell you, the address listed for Leadership Development Seminars was the Arlington headquarters of the Fellowship Foundation. So that's how close they were. What we found were tax filings from Leadership Development Seminars where they literally reported spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on expenses, including having Russians attend the National Prayer Breakfast. And the reason that's significant is because now it goes beyond just saying, sure, you can have some tickets. Now it's helping. It's actively providing material aid, and it seems to be coming from a group that's very closely entwined with the Fellowship Foundation. And given all the questions about potential Russian money moving through the NRA, there's some question now about what this all means. In fact, Congressman Ted Lieu responded to our findings by saying his chief of staff told us something like, if there's Russian influence on the National Prayer Breakfast, the congressman wants to know about it.
Yeah, and hopefully as a result of your investigation and what you've been able to find out, perhaps people like Ted Lieu and others might not go. Now, there are many other reasons which you've described and we've talked about that these Democrats should not be attending there, but you've done great work in finding out previously unknown information about the extent they'd gone to help out Maria Butina and others, giving them tickets that are extremely valuable. It's a place where people can go and they have a great deal of access to powerful people. I did also want to mention, so I know know that TYT Investigates is working on multiple stories at the same time. You're also investigating elements of the shutdown, and I believe you have a new story on the FAA. Would you be able to just briefly describe that so people might go and take a look at it?
Yeah, sure. That's actually Ken, who also worked, I should mention, on Ken Klippenstein, also worked on some of the stories we did last summer about some of the anti-gay meetings that were sponsored in Europe by the Fellowship Foundation. Ken's story yesterday that we put up, I think it was yesterday, it blurs together. Ken's story yesterday was he obtained emails from inside the FAA where FAA officials were telling employees, essentially warning them against publicly sharing their political views. Now, in theory, that's an innocuous, or maybe not innocuous, but it's a fairly standard kind of thing. But for that kind of warning to come out literally at the same time that the president is out there routinely claiming that federal workers support this shutdown, which is, financially torpedoed so many of them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think what Donald Trump should have said is they support the shutdown or else. But in any event, I wish we had more time. Hopefully in the near future, we'll be able to talk more about your investigation. It is available at tyt.com, and Jonathan does a great job of laying out all of the financial breadcrumbs, basically, that lead between these shadowy organizations and the prayer breakfast, and also politicians from both parties that have taken part. And unless people put pressure on them, might well do that in the future. So, Jonathan, thank you both for your great work in this story, but also joining us today on the Damage Report.
Thanks very much. And just a quick note, Ted Lieu's chief of staff afterwards told us he thinks it's likely that the congressman will pass this year. So really? it does seem that some members of Congress are willing to take a second look at participation in this. But anyway, thank you for having me on the show.
Okay. Good job. Yeah. A little bit of progress there, and we'll keep up on that. So thank you again to Jonathan. You can check out not only the story of Jonathan's, but also Ken's piece on the FAA at tyt.com. With that, we're going to take a short break, come back with a little bit more for you. The recent Gillette masculinity ad was not an assault on American men, but unintentionally it has utterly destroyed right-wing men across the country, shattering their minds like a person staring into the wet, tentacled maw of great Cthulhu. And they have not recovered, might never recover. But I want to provide some evidence for that statement, and that has to do with Matt Walsh of the Daily Wire, who was on Fox and Friends talking about this and coming off like a raving lunatic. Here's a little bit.
I think the part that you showed is really what rubs me the wrong way, where it says that, we were acting wrong, we didn't know what we were doing, and then the Me Too movement came along, and it was this sort of epiphany where we all realized, like, oh, actually, we're not supposed to assault and abuse women. Oh, here's the thing. I didn't learn anything from the Me Too movement. I learned nothing at all because I already knew that, okay? I didn't see a news report about Harvey Weinstein and say, oh, we're not supposed to do that. That's not how most men reacted because we already knew. Most men are just normal, decent people and already know.
A lot of men would think that's wrong, and some of these men that are being accused of this know that it's wrong. They just knew that they weren't going to ever get caught. And now the whole country's talking about it. There's a Me Too movement. And this ad, in my opinion, holds men accountable, and it tells them, hey, we got to be better. What's wrong with that message?
That is not only the most reasonable thing that Ainsley Earhart has ever said, it's all of the reasonable things that she has ever said, but I'm glad that she said it. He instead said, look, he is saying, I already knew not to do those things, and it enrages me that you would ask me not to do what I already know I'm not supposed to do. You know how a reasonable person responds to being told not to do something that they already know not to do? They say, yeah, I won't. That's how I responded to all this stuff. That's how I responded to the ad. I didn't see it to be a personal assault because I know that it's not actually assaulting me because I know the values that I hold and that I pursue. He is incredibly defensive for incredibly suspicious reasons, and it leads him to make ever increasingly ridiculous comments. Now, he is going to say something in this next video that is so sexist that I am shocked that even on Fox and Friends, they didn't respond to it. So as you're watching this, don't look at him. I want you to look at the hosts on Fox and Friends. They're kind of fine with it. Let's watch.
Well, because number one, most men, again, don't need this message. You're not going to find an advertisement like that directed at women. Like, you're not going to find an advertisement that shows women, gossiping and nagging their husbands and shopping too much, and then it says, well, but some women know the right way to act, and then it shows women having this epiphany and realizing they're not supposed to do those things.
What are you talking about? What are you talking about, you madman? You're not gonna nagging your man. Women be shopping. What are you talking about? They were describing how men are okay with sexual harassment, bullying, like criminal things, not being a nag. And here's the thing, Ainsley Earhart, I guess she knows what she gets paid for, so she just responds stoically. Ducey goes, a little bit. And the other one, what is it, Kilmeade? I think it's Kilmeade. He smiles like a crazy person upon seeing this comment about nags and shopping and all of that. This is a reminder, by the way, because he's talking like a character from a sitcom in the 1950s who's angry with his wife. And remember, the audience watching that show watched sitcoms in the 1950s and they loved it and they want more of it. So just bear that in mind as you're going forward. But again, reasonable men who are not like hanging on by a thread to their masculinity, did not see that Gillette ad as an assault against them. They saw it and thought two things. First thing they thought was, hey, that's Anna. The second thing was, yeah, we should be better. And then they went on about their lives. They didn't lose it, okay? And they certainly didn't lose it for multiple days. There are still people raving on Twitter against this ad, launching campaigns to get Anna taken out of it, which is sort of a bizarre thing. I really don't want her to be in this ad that I don't want to be on TV at all. But that's the position that they hold. Again, it has shattered their minds. We will have to see if they ever recover. That said, I want to move on to one positive, fun story to close it out. Cardi B is on Instagram Live. I have not generally watched many of her videos, but thank God that she's there because she recently weighed in on the government shutdown and made more sense than the vast majority of political commentators I've heard on this topic. Here's what she said.
Hey, y'all, I just want to remind y'all because it's been a little bit over 3 weeks, okay? It's been a little bit over 3 weeks. Trump is now ordering, as in summoning, federal government workers to go back to work without getting paid. Now, I don't want to hear y'all talking about, oh, but Obama shut down the government for 17 days. Yeah, bitch, for healthcare. So your grandma could check her blood pressure and you bitches could go check your in the gynecologist with no problem. Now, I know a lot of y'all don't care because y'all don't work for the government or y'all probably don't even have a job, but this is really fucking serious, bro. This is crazy. Like, our country is in a hellhole right now. All for wall. Like, we really need to take this serious. I feel like we need to take some action. I don't know what type of action, bitch, because this is not what I do. But, bitch, I'm scared. This is crazy. And I really feel bad for these people that got to go to work to not get paid.
Okay, so that was absolutely awesome. So credit to her, obviously. The reason I saw it was because Jordan Ewell, who's been on the show previously, he put it on Twitter, and it's got like 1 million likes. Understandably, because what she is expressing is a real person's real concerns about the ridiculous fun and games that's going on in Washington, D.C. right now. All of the political stuff, and then the foundation of it, which is Trump's ridiculous racist desire to have billions of dollars to pay for this wall. And she expresses those concerns without descending in the sort of both sidesism and whataboutism that typifies most of the mainstream media conversations about this story. So she immediately jumps on that train of thought by saying, yeah, there have been previous government shutdowns, but that's not the same thing. What were those government shutdowns about? They were about things like continuing healthcare and things like that. So the idea that simply because there have been other shutdowns, this one is just as morally, supportable or just as reasonable or just as politically, whatever, doesn't actually bear out. And so she does a great job of talking about that. By the way, so she's done other political, both Instagram lives and comments in the past that are absolutely awesome. So it turns out I need to follow her activity more closely. You might want to too. I was recently reminded that back in 2016, relatively early on, she was talking about how scared she was of Donald Trump becoming president. And she says, you know what? Don't even talk about that. Don't put that out there. Vote Daddy Bernie. Bitches, she says, to be fair. which is totally true and totally needs to be a t-shirt ASAP. So anyway, great stuff from Cardi B there. I am sure that she is going to be attacked endlessly over this on Fox News today in a way that is going to be simultaneously condescending, misogynistic, and racist at the same time. But she is doing what every American who is concerned about the state of our country should do. Make your voice heard. And she thankfully has a great platform to do that. Anyway, thank you for watching. I know that we don't have much time. I did want to read one of the iTunes reviews. I've been encouraging you guys to do that because it's super important. So Lalo Garcia says, the Damage Report was a great idea. I listen to it almost every day while walking my dogs. JR Wednesday are the best. So thank you for that. And Haunted Beard Rebel, who I think I know who that is, says, I've been following John's career for a few years now, and I gotta say, between Think Tank, True North, and John's other stuff that I don't pay attention to, this is by far my favorite, and I like everything else too. Pretty awesome stuff, so thank you, Haunted Beard, for that. Tim Coy says, an essential part of my day, love all the guests and guest hosts. John is the best, so thank you. And thank you for watching, doing the rating if you do. We'll see you tomorrow with much more news. Thanks for listening to the full episode of The Damage Report. Support our work, listen ad-free, access members-only bonus content, and more by subscribing to Apple Podcasts at apple.co/TYT. I'm your host, John Adarola. I'll see you soon.